Good day. Today is 18th July 2025, and today I have to say that looking at the events of the last 2 or 3 weeks, it seems to me that even as the Western powers make every effort to project an impression of strength and purpose, both in terms of the conflict with Russia and specifically the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, but also generally in terms of their international position. Even as the West, as I said, tries to project this appearance of strength and unity, one gets a growing sense that all of the various steps that have been taken with that regard are unconvincing, and in fact the reality of the message they give is the opposite of exhaustion and division and of growing uncertainty. Let's start again with President Trump's decision earlier this week on Monday to agree to the transfer of American weapons to be bought by the European states, to be sent to Ukraine, bought for Ukraine by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then to be transferred by NATO to Ukraine. Well, it's always possible that something is going on behind the scenes about which I am completely uninformed, but my overwhelming impression is that at the moment, nothing significant is being sent at all. Weapons do continue to arrive in Ukraine. These are from packages that were previously organized and authorized by West European governments. I am not even sure that the United States itself is transferring any weapons at the moment, though I presume it is. And here I'm talking about HIMARS rockets and artillery shells and that kind of thing. But certainly it seems as if the United States, for the moment at least, is not transferring any more Patriot air defense interceptors than the 10 that Donald Trump was apparently talking about roughly a week ago. 10. Now, we've had lots of talk about Patriot systems being sent to Ukraine. Donald Trump spoke about 17 Patriot missile systems which were ready for dispatch to Ukraine from one individual country. And I and lots of other people scratched our heads trying to work out which country that could possibly be, since none of us seem to know of any country, at least within NATO, that had 17 complete Patriot missile systems available to send. And the Ukrainians, of course, expressed the same skepticism. But anyway, reports to that effect appeared. Donald Trump talked about those Patriot missile systems being sent to Ukraine. But so far, there is no word that any one of them has indeed been sent. Now, over the last 24 hours, NATO's ground forces commander, who is of course an American general, has said that he's convening a meeting to bring together the various European states to work out who is going to provide Patriot missile systems to Ukraine and in what quantity and how it is to be done. He did, in addition, float the possibility that the United States might supply some missiles from ongoing production. But as we know, the Pentagon in particular is keen to keep all future production, current and future production of Patriot missile interceptors to itself in order to restock the massively depleted arsenals of the United States. So the NATO military commander is going to convene a meeting. We're not told when. We're not told in what kind of format. We're not even sure exactly who's going to be attending. But all of them are going to come together and they're going to discuss sending these Patriot missile interceptors or batteries or complete systems, but nobody seems to know exactly when and in what form, except it seems that the expectation is that they will come from Europe and not from the United States. As for the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, he's now made a public speech in which he has said that, in contrast to the Biden administration, the Trump administration is not going to transfer weapons to Ukraine for free. From now on, all weapons must be paid for. That is the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. President Trump puts America first. Joe Biden, by implication, put Ukraine and NATO first. So in future, all the weapons must be paid for. Now, I'm not sure, by the way, whether that includes the weapons from the package, the various packages that the Biden administration authorized during the period when Biden was still president. There are apparently still some outstanding deliveries of weapons from the last of these batches. I presume that they are being delivered to Ukraine in accordance with the original instructions from President Biden, in other words, for free. But of course, I'm not absolutely sure. Anyway, the future deliveries of weapons from the United States will have to be paid for, and they will have to be paid for by European governments. And presumably, at least according to the current thinking, if the European governments aren't prepared to pay for them or won't pay for them to the level needed by Ukraine, then there will be no more arms deliveries by the United States to Ukraine. At least that is the logic of the statements that the President and the Vice President, and indeed NATO countries in general, and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, that is the logic of what they have been saying. Some are going further still and are saying that, in fact, this arrangement that the President agreed with Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, and which he announced earlier this week, was a clever ruse to stop all further American weapons deliveries to Ukraine. I have to say, again, as is so often the case with Donald Trump, I think that is much too complicated an explanation of his thinking and of his motives. On the contrary, I'm going to say that I tend to lean more to the side of what my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has suggested, which is that if there are no major weapons purchases for Ukraine by the Europeans, so that American weapon systems seem to dwindle and even stop, and if this happens at the same time as there are further big Russian advances, I think the pressure on the president to change his policy will increase. The pressure within the United States for the United States to resume direct transfers of weapons will increase. And I have no confidence that the president himself will stick to his current line and won't agree to do that. After all, he has repeatedly shown great unwillingness to stand up to the more hardline faction within his administration, within the permanent government of the United States, and above all in the Senate and in Congress. So anyway, we are, as I said, completely uncertain about the situation in terms of weapons deliveries from the United States to Ukraine. Now, if we're talking about Patriot missiles, I'm not even sure why the United States is bothering to send these weapons, these systems, at all. If an article in the Wall Street Journal is to be believed, and I see no reason why it should not be. The Russian missiles, the Russian ballistic missiles, have now reached a level of sophistication and accuracy which means that they can outmaneuver Patriot missiles with little difficulty. They can hit targets, they can bypass Patriot air defense missile defenses, and the Patriots cannot shoot them down. In fact, I read somewhere, it might have been in this Wall Street Journal article, but I think actually it was somewhere else, that the Ukrainians are complaining that not only is the Patriot missile system no longer effective against Russian missiles, but that the Ukrainians can launch up to 100 of these missiles in the space of 10 minutes before they can manage to shoot down a single incoming Russian missile. Now, I have to say, this seems borderline fantastic to me. I cannot imagine that even the Ukrainians are able to launch 100 Patriot missiles in such a shortened timescale. And I doubt that anything like this has ever really happened. Though, of course, what do I know? It may be that there are properties and aspects to this system that I'm unfamiliar with, and it may be that it can reload and launch missiles with the speed that the Ukrainians apparently say. But if it takes 100 of these enormously expensive and very sophisticated missiles to have any hope to shoot down one incoming Russian missile, then what is the point of sending them? Given that the Russians, according to Ukraine's own reports, are now producing around 700 Iskander-M missiles a year, and another 200 or 300 less sophisticated Iskander-Ms. If you were to shoot them all down, if they're all launched against Ukraine in any one year, and you were to shoot them all down, you would, according to this claim, need around 100,000 Patriot missile interceptors, which is, of course, nonsense. It is completely ridiculous. Now, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, one of the most astute commentators about the war, and somebody, by the way, who has worked in the Pentagon and I suspect has sources of information far beyond my own, says that the United States now has only enough air defense missile interceptors and offensive missiles to undertake 8 days of intense conflict. And he questions whether the president, whether Donald Trump, has been briefed about this. I wonder whether Congress has been briefed about it either. If they have, and if despite this information they are still agitating and demanding and insisting that missiles continue to be sent to Ukraine in the same numbers that was the case before, then all I can say is they have a completely reckless approach to America's own needs. They are obviously and clearly people who, to use a 16th century expression, English expression, love another country more than their own, Ukraine in this case. I doubt that this is the case. I believe that these people in Congress simply do not believe and cannot accept and won't internalize the fact that the United States is now desperately short of Patriot missile interceptors, that it is being outproduced not just by China, but by Russia as well, and that it has no realistic prospect of ever catching up. But anyway, there we go. That's the situation with Patriot missile system deliveries. Now, I read a very interesting article or piece on Slavyangrad. This is a Telegram channel which I've referenced many times in the past. It is not a Russian Telegram channel exactly, though I believe that several people in and from Russia contribute to it. I believe it is based in the West, but it makes no secret of its strongly pro-Russian sympathies in this conflict in Ukraine. Having said that, as I've often said in the past, I have found it in general very reliable and very astute in its assessment of the military situation in the conflict area in Ukraine. Anyway, they have written a piece which I presume is based on information that comes from other Russian sources which are not available to me, that they have noticed that the Russians have noticed a change in logistical operations by Ukraine in the Pokrovsk area. That whereas previously the Ukrainians tended to use somewhat hardened, armoured trucks and vehicles to keep their forces in Pokrovsk supplied, this has essentially stopped. Losses of these vehicles have just been too high, to the point where it's becoming impossible and unaffordable to continue to use these complex and heavy and rather expensive vehicles which have to be imported or supplied by the United States, and that as a result the Ukrainians now are trying to keep their forces in Pokrovsk supplied using fast, light vehicles, flitting as quickly as they can down the main roads, the supply roads to Pokrovsk. But of course these vehicles are desperately vulnerable to Russian drones, and apparently it has become incredibly dangerous to send supplies to Pokrovsk using these thin, light vehicles. I believe this report, and I suspect that what's happening is that the United States, despite the gigantic size of its automobile industries, is finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with Ukrainian demands for supplies of even these heavier vehicles, these heavier road vehicles. The amount of damage, the amount of losses is simply too great, even for an industrial power like the United States to sustain. And this, of course, brings us back to the whole issue of the Russian drone war. There is an absolutely fantastic scheme, if I can call it that, which has been reported by various sections of the media, especially in Britain, but also in the United States, a kind of defense plan that supposedly has been put together by a think tank, a Ukrainian think tank. The premise of this plan is that there's not going to be a ceasefire, there's not going to be a negotiated solution, the war is going to continue indefinitely, and therefore, in order for Ukraine to survive, the Ukrainians need to be able to keep the Russians at bay on the contact lines indefinitely. And what this plan is proposing is that the skies on the combat line be flooded with Ukrainian drones, that the Ukrainians establish some kind of drone coverage with their drones 30, 40 kilometers behind the Russian combat lines, thereby preventing the Russians from concentrating forces closer to the contact line in order to prevent Russian breakthroughs. And the theory is that this can be achieved, and achieved in such a way that a Russian breakthrough becomes impossible, and though the war can continue indefinitely, it can continue indefinitely in that way without the Russians breaking through, without the Ukrainians losing significant territory, and that this is the solution to Ukraine's problems. This is, to repeat again, a fantastic plan. I cannot imagine that there is a single frontline soldier in the Ukrainian army who believes in this plan. Firstly, there are, even conceptually, some obvious problems with it. Briefly, even if the Ukrainians could establish that degree of drone coverage, it is inevitable that before long the Russians would develop some means to counter the drones. They have a far bigger industrial base than Ukraine, to put it mildly, a far stronger scientific and technological base as well. Sooner or later, they will find a means to counter the Ukrainian drones. There's already examples of advanced Russian weapons appearing, which are intended apparently to shoot down drones in quantities and to provide protection to frontline forces on the combat lines. It's just that we haven't yet reached that point in this war where those become available in quantity or where they have been properly perfected. But put that aside, given the realities, given what we know about drone production in Russia and drone production in Ukraine, and indeed drone production in the West as well, is it not much more likely that the people who are going to flood the sky with drones and are going to make it impossible for the Ukrainians to maneuver forces 30 or 40 kilometers behind the front lines, making a concentration of forces to enable a defense to take place, that it's going to be the Russians who are going to do that? Is that not, in fact, actually quite close to the situation we already have now? If we talk about Pokrovsk, and I was talking about the supply lines to Pokrovsk, specifically, the Ukrainians tried to copy the Russian practice, a practice that the Russians developed some months ago, of establishing dense netting over the supply roads, basically to keep FPV drones from hitting vehicles that are moving along those roads. What appears to have happened is that the Russians have shelled the roads, or they've used big and powerful drones like the Lancets and the Gerans to destroy the netting. And the result is that pictures are already appearing which show long stretches of these roads with the burst and destroyed netting hanging forlornly along the sides of the roads like broken spiders' webs. So we come back to this fundamental problem. The Russians have a well-organized and very large industrial base able to execute in this kind of way. The Ukrainians don't. The Americans and the Ukrainians and the Europeans are trying to get abreast now of drone production and of drone design. The US Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, has recently spoken about this. But inevitably, what is going to happen is that any program to develop and update Western drone fleets is going to run into all the same problems that beset every other form of procurement and production in the United States and in Europe: over complexity, fragmentation, complex and expensive supply chains, all of these things. And it is going to take time a lot of time to do. In the meantime, if we come back to Patriot missiles, the Patriot missiles cannot shoot down missiles, ballistic missiles, apparently, or at least not in any way that makes any kind of sense. If you need to use 100 to shoot down one missile, then obviously that makes no sense. They can probably shoot down drones, get on drones. You do not use a $3.5 million missile, which is in short supply, to shoot down a drone that costs perhaps $20,000, maybe even less, and which the Russians have in abundance and are producing in enormous quantity. And that is the reality of the conflict. So that's the situation so far with military supplies. My own sense is that with every single day now, the imbalance grows sharper and greater in terms of manpower and equipment as well. When talking about manpower, by the way, the Ukrainian government, Zelensky's office, have now made an announcement that there will be no demobilization of Ukrainian troops currently serving with the Ukrainian army until the war itself ends. So anybody who is in the Ukrainian army is going to remain in that army until the war ends, which may be, of course, in a few months' time or a year's time, depending on how long it takes for Ukraine to be defeated. But there is no prospect of demobilization until that point is reached. To say that this is going to be an unpopular decision in Ukraine hardly describes it. And of course, it's going to make all attempts to conscript more sections of the Ukrainian population more difficult still, because Ukrainians, Ukrainian men, and some women who are now being conscripted to the front lines now probably say to themselves, the only way of leaving the army is either through desertion, and desertion in Ukraine is now becoming a major problem, or through death or severe injury. Hardly an attractive prospect in any conceivable way. Anyway, that's talking about the logistics, the actual military situation. What about everything else? Well, yesterday, the European Union voted through its 18th sanctions package. Now, this package has run into opposition, and it took multiple votes before it was finally voted through. The countries that vetoed it were Slovakia and Malta. I'm not sure what role, if any, Hungary played, though Viktor Orban has made it pretty clear that he does not agree with this package. The Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, also made it pretty clear that he doesn't agree with this package either, but he also made it clear fairly early on that despite Slovakia's strong disagreement with the package, Slovakia by itself, and even backed by Hungary and Malta, simply doesn't have the weight within the European Union to veto this package indefinitely. Sooner or later, it would have to back down and let the package go through. It would try to carve out some exemptions to protect itself. To some extent, it appears to have done so, though I don't know the details, but the package now has gone through. And predictably, European officials are hailing it as a breakthrough, the most stringent package that has been imposed upon Russia up to now. It's going to be the final word that's going to tip the Russians towards, well, I'm not sure towards what exactly, but anyway, it's going to make it impossible for the Russians to sustain their war machine, or more difficult for them to do so. But of course, the details of the package itself, so far as one can tell, hardly live up to that. 105 more tankers from the so-called Shadow Fleet have been sanctioned, but I've already discussed in many programs that sanctioning these tankers, many of which are old, really makes no sense, because this is a constantly changing picture. Tankers come and go, they change names, they change registrations. It's going to be very difficult for European officials to keep up with this endless kaleidoscope. And of course, some tankers stop operating, others join in this export scheme. There is never a single body of tankers operating. This idea of closing down Russia's shadow fleet is inevitably going to fail. I've already discussed in previous programs how the very concept of a shadow fleet is wrong. All it means is a collection of ships which are not being insured in the insurance market in London. And the insurance market in London, as I have discussed at inordinate length in program after program, no longer has the monopoly on maritime insurance that it did in the 1960s, say. In fact, there are many other places where tankers and ships can get insured today, and there are specialized types of insurance which, as a result of other sanctions decisions against various insurance groups, ship owners who operate these tankers can also obtain for them. But if the concept shadow, the word shadow, really has no meaning, actually, neither does the word fleet, because that presumes a single group of vessels operating this trade. And of course, that is very, very far from being the case. What we're talking about is the entire maritime industry. Ships sometimes will pick up cargoes in all sorts of places, some of them in Russia, some of them in other places. Things move around. As I said, ships join, ships leave. There is never any single set group of tankers that can be targeted in this way. The European Union is chasing a mirage. If we're talking about Nord Stream, again, Friedrich Merz has got his wish. There is now sanctions that preclude Nord Stream pipelines ever being put into operation again. To my mind, that is an act of economic suicide by Germany. How does that affect Russia, which isn't exporting any gas at this time through those pipelines and has no expectation in future of ever doing so? Various other Russian banks have been disconnected from the SWIFT interbank payment system. Some people might be surprised that there are still banks in Russia that are connected to the SWIFT interbank payment system. The vast majority of Russian bank transactions no longer use it. Again, this is not going to have any significant effect at all. And of course, lots of individuals and companies in Russia are also being sanctioned. But again, how is that realistically going to make any difference? The Europeans are now saying that they will cease to import energy products from Russia, I believe by 2028, which, as far as I'm concerned, is another act of economic suicide. There is currently in the West, it is controversial with many people, a decision to move away from the green policies, the electrification policies, the renewable energy policies, back to fossil fuels. I'm not going to discuss in this program the merits of that. All I will say is that if you're going to go back to reliance on gas and oil, then where are you going to buy it from? Obviously, to some extent, you're talking about oil from the Gulf, from other oil producers. Though if you restrict yourself to a certain group of producers, then of course that puts them in an advantage over you, and they can raise the price. If you're talking about liquefied natural gas and oil from the United States, and you are recommitting to fossil fuels, then you need to keep in mind the fact, or should be keeping in mind the fact, that American oil and gas production has probably peaked and looks set to decline. The priority for the US government will be providing cheap energy to the domestic US economy. If these reports about a decline of fossil fuel production in the United States are correct, which, by the way, I believe they are, then there will inevitably, before long, be less of this energy, less of this fuel to supply by the United States to Europe, pushing up energy costs in Europe further still. It's difficult to understand the logic of this decision, all the more so since, for the moment at least, the United States is not supporting these sanctions. They have not agreed to the European decision to reduce the oil price cap on oil that is shipped by tankers that are insured in London, to reduce it from $60 a barrel to $45 a barrel. The United States is not joining in that. I didn't know, by the way, that there were any tankers insured in London that carry Russian oil at this time. Perhaps there are. But anyway, that oil price cap has already failed. I don't understand why anybody is persisting with this. And, of course, the Americans, who, by the way, in Biden's time, first proposed it, it was Janet Yellen's idea, have, it seems, for the moment, lost interest in it. So why the European Union persists with it, I don't know. One might expect that there are other more serious matters for the Europeans to worry about. Donald Trump, about a week ago, said that he was going to impose 30% tariffs on imports into the United States from the European Union. German employers groups are advising the German government that if this happens, it will be a disaster for German industry. Germany's entire export model will be in crisis. They are apparently advising the German government that it's looking increasingly unlikely with this tariff announcement and with the other problems in the global economy that the German economy will indeed return to growth this year. It has contracted for the previous 2 years. It looks like it's going to contract this year as well. There were hopes that the contraction would end next year and that Germany would return to growth. But if this tariff announcement by the United States becomes effective on the 1st of August, that's just 2 weeks from now, then the German employers groups are telling the German government that Germany will almost certainly see a further contraction next year as well. That will be 4 consecutive years of contraction. Maybe not a deep recession, but a very prolonged one, and one that is taking place over a period of intense, sustained deindustrialization, and one where the effect on living standards in Germany has been mitigated largely through spending by the German government providing subsidies and by spending. And of course, Chancellor Merz and his social democratic allies have more and further spending programs ahead of them. Of course, spending cannot continue indefinitely, and sooner or later, one presumes it will have to be reined in, and at that point, one also presumes, I see no reason why it wouldn't happen. At that point, the effect of deindustrialization, of the contraction of the German economy, of the breakdown in Germany's historic export model, well, that would hit home. But you would expect Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, you would expect his government to be focused fully on addressing this issue. Firstly, obviously, they should be trying to persuade Donald Trump to change his tariff policy towards the European Union. He hasn't shown any sign up to now of wanting to do that. But then again, Trump is fickle and says one thing and often changes his mind and does something else. But for the record, up to now, I get the distinct impression that Merz has been more interested in talking Ukraine-related matters with Trump than with talking to him about the underlying and increasing problems of Germany's economy. Just saying. Anyway, the alternative, obviously, would be to rely less on the United States. And there are plenty of other places where Germany could look to for export markets. Asia, for example. China, in particular, with which Germany once had a thriving relationship. There are other places from which Germany could obtain its LNG and its oil, which could become especially important in the next few years as exports of oil and gas from the United States are likely to fall. Just saying. Russia would be the obvious place, but we see that Germany and the German political leadership are working overtime to close off all those options. They've quarrelled with the Chinese. They've burnt all their bridges, I think irrevocably, with the Russians. It would need a political revolution in Berlin to cause the Russians to even reconsider re-establishing the old trade links again. Merz's policy appears to be to rely even more on the United States. As I've discussed in previous programs, the NATO deal to buy arms via NATO for Ukraine sooner or later inevitably is going to mean Germany buying arms through NATO, not for Ukraine, but for itself, deindustrializing Germany still further, undermining Germany's own military-industrial complex, increasing the pressures on Germany's exports, quite plausibly before long causing Germany to move from being an exporter to being a country that runs deficits, not just in its external trade, but in its current account. But anyway, that seems to be the course upon which Germany follows. Now, even as this is going on, and again, I come back to my point at the start of this program about how when you actually look beneath the surface, all the problems and the divisions and the quarrels start to come to the surface. We've now had an incredible utopian budget from the European Commission. They have proposed a massive increase in the European budget. Ursula von der Leyen presented it to the European Parliament in euphoric terms. It includes, I believe, 160 billion euros over the next 7 years of support for Ukraine, but it also envisages an enormous increase in budgetary spending by the European Union. And of course, it is doing that even as every other European state, all the European states collectively, are having to consider consolidation, budget consolidation, because all of them are now heavily in debt and are facing a fiscal crisis, at least the big ones are. So Friedrich Merz, who doesn't like Ursula von der Leyen, they have had long-standing issues with each other, traceable back to their joint time in German politics. Anyway, Friedrich Merz is furious with Ursula von der Leyen's budget proposal. He says it doesn't make any kind of sense. He says this budget should be rejected. The French Parliament, which is becoming increasingly rancorous and rebellious and deeply unhappy with President Macron's policies. Of course, as a result of the parliamentary elections that Macron foolishly called last year, the combined left and the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, have a theoretical majority in it. Anyway, the French National Assembly, the French Parliament, has also spoken with outrage about this budget. The mood of the French Parliament can be judged, in fact, quite well from a recent document, position paper, that one of its committees published, which said that the policy of attaching France and Europe to the United States, of pursuing Atlanticist objectives, makes absolutely no sense, that it is sacrificing French and European interests to American geopolitical objectives. And this position paper did the unthinkable of suggesting that Europe and France instead start to seek some kind of way back with Russia, but above all, pursue close and friendly relations with China instead of the United States. Now, to be very clear, this is one position paper by one committee of the French Parliament. It is certainly not the French government's policy. I still don't expect it to become French government policy at any point. But anyway, it is unsurprising that a French Parliament that could produce that kind of paper should be infuriated, absolutely outraged by Ursula von der Leyen's latest budget. Nonetheless, I still expect Ursula to insist on her budget. She will no doubt present it to the European Parliament. The European Parliament showed a significant increase in opposition to her in the vote of no confidence in her that was called and which was voted on a short while back. The number of European MPs who voted to remove Ursula increased by about 40 as compared to what happened in the previous vote. But She still looks secure to me. I don't get the sense that her position is slipping. She still seems to have the overall support of a clear majority of MPs in the French Parliament, the European Parliament, and I expect the budget to be voted through. Whether it will be implemented, of course, is a completely different matter, and it may run into problems at the level of the Council of Ministers. Probably there will have to be some walkback in a number of places, but overall, and nonetheless, I still expect it to be voted through. Anyway, all of this, we can see again disagreements. Germany and France against the European Union over budget policy, disagreements about future foreign policy, illogical decisions in economic policy. The Germans supporting the most hardline positions the European Union is taking on sanctions policy, but complaining about a budget that ultimately derives from that same set of policies that the German government currently is supporting. Now, there's been another really very extraordinary step, which is it's getting less attention than it perhaps deserves, because Keir Starmer and Friedrich Merz have now signed some kind of defence agreement with each other. One which apparently promises that each of these countries will come to the defence of the other if they're attacked, and which some sections of the media in Britain, and I believe in Germany, are speaking up and talking of as some kind of German-British military alliance. Now, no one I know, has spoken about what an incredible departure this is. Britain and Germany are signing a military alliance with each other, calling each other allies. But they are already allies. They already have commitments to each other, military commitments to each other. They do so through NATO, of which they are both members. Given Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, why do they need to make a further agreement of this kind? One which simply repeats the same commitments that Britain and Germany have to each other under the NATO treaty. Nobody that I have seen has really discussed this properly. Could it be that this is just theatre? That this is Merz and Starmer, both with growing domestic problems, both becoming increasingly unpopular, both perhaps unsure of remaining leaders of their respective countries for very long, coming together, agreeing some kind of a military pact to make it look as if they're doing something important and that they therefore are important. Is it all theatre? Maybe so. Probably so. But there is an alternative explanation, and that is that the bureaucracies, the German and British defence bureaucracies, which presumably drew up this treaty or agreement or whatever it is, are now worrying that the US commitment to NATO is not going to be indefinite. They're probably looking beyond Donald Trump and at the realities of the limits of American power that I have discussed in many programs. And they're saying to themselves that the time has therefore come for Germany and Britain to kind of sort out their relations with each other, to establish a treaty with each other as some kind of insurance in case NATO itself breaks down. In which case this agreement is not anti-Russian, as some people are saying. It is actually anti-American. It puts a question mark over the relationship of each of these two countries, the long-term relationship of each of these two countries with the United States. Now, I say that because I can say with absolute certainty that if an agreement of this kind had been proposed between Britain and Germany at any point during the Cold War, say in the 1970s, the Americans would have strongly objected and would almost certainly have stopped it. They would have said, why are you making this kind of agreement when you are already bound by the NATO treaty? You are acting in a way that undermines the credibility of the NATO treaty, and by doing so, you are expressing disloyalty and disrespect towards us. Well, there'd be no such objections this time. I would add that if we're talking about the period of the Cold War, another country would have also vigorously objected to an agreement of this kind, and that, of course, would have been France. The French would have been outraged by a plan of this kind. I can just imagine what someone like de Gaulle, for example, or even Mitterrand would have said if the Germans and the British had come together and agreed a defence pact, however nebulous it is, of this sort. Now, one is tempted to say that there is now some indications of a dividing line beginning to appear in Europe. A northern bloc, Britain, Germany, the Scandinavian states, Holland, the Netherlands, the Baltic states, very anti-Russian, taking a very hard line on foreign policy, working out military arrangements with each other, prepared to buy weapons from the United States and using NATO as a vehicle. An alternative southern bloc, arguably led by France, but including Italy and Spain, and the other Mediterranean states, much more skeptical in the long term about the conflict with Russia, about proximity to the United States, unwilling to buy weapons directly from the United States using NATO as a vehicle or any of that kind. I think it's far too early to speak of two blocs emerging within Europe of that kind, but perhaps we're starting to see something like that, the first glimmers of that starting to happen. I'd say something, if we ever do get to the point where blocs of this nature emerge, and by the way, the history and culture of Europe would make such blocs in some respect unsurprising. A northern Germanic, northern Protestant bloc against a southern Mediterranean, predominantly Latin, predominantly Catholic bloc. Anyway, if something like that ever were to appear, then it is a virtual certainty that a certain degree of hostility would emerge or develop between the two. And that, of course, would be the end of the European Union and of NATO and of forming any kind of united front against Russia. I'm not going to labour this point because obviously we're very far from that point now. But anyway, all of this is going on, and as I said, there's no real sign of unity or purpose at all that I can see. Meanwhile, we still have the threat of Donald Trump's tariffs against the Russians and of those countries that trade with Russia in 50 days. And we have an absolutely ferocious editorial about it from Global Times. Chinese newspaper, which, as I said many times, is owned by the People's Daily, which is the the media organ of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. So Global Times is only one step removed from the Chinese leadership and must be presumed to be articulating Chinese policy. And this editorial ferociously condemns this whole 100% tariff threat against China and other trading partners of Russia, which the president announced when he spoke with Mark Rutte. It contains comments like this. This threat reflects the West's current sense of powerlessness in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Zhang Hun, a research fellow at the Institute of Russian, Eastern European and Central Asian Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told Global Times that despite the Russia-Ukraine conflict lasting over 3 years, the West has imposed nearly 30,000 sanctions on Russia, but these measures have failed to change Moscow's stance. Instead, the war has dragged on longer and Ukraine has suffered great losses. When direct sanctions on Russia proved ineffective, the West has turned to threatening secondary sanctions, attempting to pressure third-party countries to coerce Russia. This approach not only reveals NATO's arrogant attitude in global politics, but also underscores its lack of respect for emerging economies. So the Chinese here are speaking not just for themselves, but for countries like India as well. And by the way, though there isn't enough time to discuss this at length in this program, there have been the first steps being taken over the last couple of days by China and India to patch up their differences left over from the Indo-Pakistani clashes of a few weeks ago. Anyway, the Global Times article then continues. Currently, negotiations in the Russia-Ukraine conflict are deadlocked, and NATO is doing little to promote genuine peace dialogue. Instead, it is exacerbating the conflict through increased military aid, expanded sanctions, and threats against third-party countries. For over 3 years since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, NATO, led by the United States, has supplied Ukraine with substantial military aid and repeatedly relaxed restrictions on Kiev's use of weapons, thereby prolonging the war. NATO has never reflected on its own responsibility. Instead, it has grown accustomed to deflecting responsibility. For example, NATO frequently exploits normal China-Russia trade relations, falsely claiming that China is supplying Russia with military aid and sensationalizing Chinese responsibility and the Chinese threat rhetoric. Now it has escalated these tactics. On one hand, threatening to impose secondary sanctions against countries maintaining normal trade with Russia. On the other, intensifying the flow of lethal weapons to Ukraine. This hypocrisy and double standards is evident to all. To defame normal trade among China, Brazil, India and Russia as aid to Russia and threaten sanctions over it is both naive and unrealistic. Zhang, this is the expert they consulted before, believes the key to resolving the Russia-Ukraine conflict lies in addressing Russia's core security concerns. If the fundamental concerns of both Russia and Ukraine are not resolved, the fighting will not cease. NATO's threats of secondary sanctions against emerging economies to pressure them into swaying Russia is not only impractical but also doomed to fail. In truth, the root cause of the Russia-Ukraine conflict lies in NATO's continued eastward expansion, blatantly ignoring its promises not to expand. Yet today, NATO seeks to blame others for the consequences it has caused. That is perhaps the single most important sentence. The root cause, remember, the Russians constantly refer to root causes. It appears in every comment that Putin makes about the conflict in Ukraine. The root cause of the Russia-Ukraine conflict lies in NATO's continued eastward expansion, blatantly ignoring its promises not to expand. On that topic, I should say that Pascal Lotas at Neutrality Studies has done an absolutely brilliant piece in which he has, drawing upon decisions of the International Court of Justice in 1974, in which he says, drawing on those precedents, those legal precedents, that contrary to what is often said, the verbal promises given to Russia in 1990 and 1991, that, and thereafter as well, by the way, that NATO would not be expanded eastwards, do carry weight under international law. In fact, they are binding under international law. Pascal Lotas has actually found a precedent from 1974 in which the International Court of Justice said that those kind of assurances create a legal obligation independent of whether or not they are reduced to writing. So far, the Russians have never made that claim, but I cannot imagine that they are not aware of this precedent. And here we see in this article in Global Times what the Chinese think about it. And then the editorial ends, the true path to peace lies in respecting the core concerns of all parties and seeking balance through equitable dialogue rather than fostering new conflicts through threats and sanctions. Well, after reading an article like this, an editorial like this, from a publication, which, as I said, is only one step removed from the Chinese leadership, no one should be left in any doubt at all that the Chinese are not going to observe the threats, are going to reject the threats, the pressure from the United States to stop buying oil or uranium or whatever from Russia. This puts, it seems to me, the United States in an impossible position. Because if the Chinese take this stance, and there was never the slightest doubt that they would not, I can't imagine anybody who seriously believed that the Chinese would obey the American order to stop trading with Russia. If the Chinese are going to take this stance, then how can the United States not impose tariffs, 100% tariffs on China, which of course the United States dare not do because China could cut off supplies of rare earths and conduct the other retaliatory measures that almost brought the US and Western economies to a standstill in the spring. How can the United States not impose tariffs against China, but impose these kind of punitive tariffs against India, which it claims it wants as a friend, and which it has some sort of relationship with through the various organizations that it has spun and created as part of its attempts to contain China. This editorial in Global Times, in my opinion, has killed the entire sanctions tariff policy that President Trump outlined when he met Mark Rutte on Monday. I don't know how President Trump is going to get round the problem of Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal and the Senate, but I would suggest that they all of them sit down and read this editorial and draw what I would have thought were the obvious conclusions. Anyway, there it is. Meanwhile, even as the Chinese make their stance completely clear, the Russians have been making their stance clear as well. Dmitry Medvedev, the head of the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, which I think technically makes him Russia's number two. Formally, the number two is the Prime Minister Mishustin. But I think in reality, in the overall structure of the Russian leadership, it is Medvedev who outranks Mishustin. Just saying. But anyway, Medvedev has now given an interview to TASS in which he's floated the possibility of Russia conducting preemptive strikes against bases, NATO bases in Europe, if the threat of missile strikes against Russia, against Moscow specifically, using long-range missiles, such as was talked about last week, the Tomahawk missiles launched from Ukraine, in case that threat ever actually materializes. And I understand that the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman has confirmed that this is an option that the Russians reserve the right to exercise, though the Russian Foreign Ministry, as of the time of my making this program, has not produced a complete transcript of her latest briefing in which she set that out. Now, I ought to say that this is not a departure. Vladimir Putin himself, last year, when the possibility of the Western powers supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine capable of conducting strikes on Russian territory, pre-2014 Russian territory, when that was first floated, himself said that in these situations, the Russians would have the right to conduct strikes against NATO bases, including bases in Europe. Now, that didn't happen when a few ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes took place back in the autumn, mostly because, well, in fact, entirely because those strikes turned out to be completely ineffective. If we're talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles, then I think the situation changes. As I've discussed previously, these are strategic systems. The Russians would treat them as such, and I suspect that the reaction would be very, very much tougher, even if in practice none of the Tomahawks got through. Putin has spoken about the fact that Russia is engaged in serial production of the Oreshnik missile. John Helmer has said that, to his knowledge, the moment when Oreshniks come into service in Russia in quantity is now very close. Quite plausibly, these missiles will be deployed very soon. They might be used, of course, in the conflict in Ukraine, but the Russians could potentially use them to strike at targets anywhere in Europe, and that must then be a possibility if the Tomahawks are used to conduct strikes against Moscow. I think that if we do have strikes against Moscow of that kind, that possibility is real. Anyway, for the moment at least, the Americans have pulled back from that idea. Donald Trump has said that he is opposed to strikes against Moscow. Let's hope that he sticks to that. Now, I'm going to finish off this program with two further comments. Firstly, the war goes on and the Russian advances continue. And they are continuing and intensifying mostly, well, in many different places along the front lines. But perhaps most specifically and most dramatically in the area of the town of Pokrovsk. There are reports now that the Russians are indeed storming the Krasny Limansky coal mine north of Novoekonomichny, and that they have also either captured or are in the process of capturing a village called Suchetske, which is located to the north of the Krasno-Limansky mine, and to the west of the villages of Fyodorivka and Razinye, which some Russian bloggers and map projects claim that the Russians already control. And of course, if this is true, then the Russians, if they captured this coal mine and are in control of Sukhetske, they are very close to the village of Rodinske. And by the way, from Sukhetske, they are also they're already close to the road that leads to Pokrovsk, and which passes through Rodinske. They could cut the road if they advanced west of Sukhetske, north of Rodinske itself. So I'm not absolutely certain what is actually going on in this area. There were reports yesterday, for example, that the Ukrainians had mostly pulled out of Novoekonomichny itself, that this place now is mostly surrounded. That could be true, or it might not. Again, I don't know. But all of the reports say that the situation is becoming worse by the hour for the Ukrainians. And I discussed earlier in this program how it seems that the netting along the supply roads has been destroyed by the Russians, either with artillery or heavy drones, that the Ukrainians are now reduced to using light vehicles. It already looks as if there is a deepening supply crisis for the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk. And there were more reports yesterday about the Russians having captured the village of Udachny to the southwest of Pokrovsk, but I haven't yet seen any confirmation of this from sources that you might consider reliable. There are Russian advances in many other places. There are again reports that the Russians have now finally occupied the southern part of Yunakovka in Sumy region, which would suggest that the Ukrainians might have been cleared from the high ground to the south of this village. I'm not sure about this, but there are reports to that effect. The Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that the village of Kamyanska, south of Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, has now been fully captured by the Russians. The Russians apparently are engaged in a battle for another village called Plavny to the north, further up the east bank of the Dnieper towards the city of Zaporozhye itself. It's been suggested that the Russians will stop their northward advance towards Zaporozhye from this village, along these villages, because the next village further up, a village called Stepnogorsk, apparently is a relatively modern, newly built village with the high rises, which supposedly dominate the landscape. And there are even some comparisons being made with Ugledar, the coal mining town in southern Donetsk, which the Russians captured in October after many difficult battles, because the high rises that make up Ugledar are a natural fortress. I doubt that Stepnogorsk would be quite as challenging a place to capture as Ugledar. The reason, very simply, is that it is very much smaller. Ugledar had a population of between 15 and 20,000. Stepnogorsk is a village, a big village, which apparently at its height had a population of around 4,000. By definition, that must mean that there are fewer of these big high-rise buildings in Stepnogorsk, far fewer of them. There can't be that many able to support each other. And if there is a sustained attack on this village, I doubt that it can be held for very long. But anyway, there are those reports circulating, and there are also reports that the Russians are now preparing some big offensive in the south, in Zaporozhye region. But then we've heard these reports many times, and who knows. But anyway, there are other advances in the Konstantinovka area, but the focus remains Pokrovsk. It's perhaps a mistake to focus so much on Pokrovsk as I do in these programs, but it is the biggest battle at the moment, and it is generally accepted that if Pokrovsk falls, the way is open for a Russian advance, a further Russian advance, an even stronger Russian advance westwards towards the Dnieper, towards the cities of Dnipro and Zaporozhye, but also for a Russian advance northwards, outflanking the cities of Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, and creating what would potentially be the biggest encirclement operation by far of this war up to now. So anyway, the war continues, the Russian advances continue, the situation for the Ukrainians gets worse. We'll see what happens in Rodinske, but certainly the Battle of Pokrovsk is now well and truly underway, and most expect that the city, the defenses of the city will collapse at some point within the next few weeks. Now, I'm going to touch on another topic, which is the Israeli bombing of Damascus, the defense ministry in Damascus, and the expulsion by Israel of the Syrian forces of President al-Sharaa, if I can call him that, al-Jalani as he was, from southern Syria, from the Druze regions of southern Syria. I'm not going to discuss Israel's very interesting and, in my opinion, frankly implausible claims of undying loyalty to the Druze people of southern Syria. If the Israelis had really been interested in protecting the Druze in southern Syria, it seems to me they would have given quiet assistance to President Assad, who never at any time threatened Israel itself, just to say, and who was, at least to a great extent, in fact, the protector of the Druze, just saying. This episode in Syria in my opinion, has been overanalyzed. There's a lot of commentary and discussion about how Israel and Turkey are on a collision course with each other. There have been some ferocious comments from each side about the other. And of course, in Israel, those perpetual hardliners, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, are openly talking about the need not just to overthrow President al-Sharaa, but actually to assassinate him. He is another person, apparently, who is fit for decapitation. If he is indeed killed, I do wonder what the European Union, and by the way, the Trump administration, which has ostentatiously embraced al-Sharaa, putting aside or forgetting his jihadi background, I wonder what they will say. But in all honesty and truth, I believe that there will be no such clash. Al-Sharaa has already weakly withdrawn his forces from southern Syria, basically turning it into an Israeli-controlled area. I said after President Assad fell that Syria would now in effect be partitioned, that the various powers that surround Syria would establish their own spheres of influence there, that we would have Turkish and Israeli spheres of influence, a Turkish sphere in the north, perhaps extending to Damascus, though Damascus might, I suppose, become a kind of contested zone, an Israeli sphere along the Israeli border, a Russian sphere. The Russians still have their bases, and they're still present in western Syria, in the coastal regions. They haven't so far done much with those bases to try to establish a sphere of influence, but I think potentially in time they might do so. My own view that this is exactly what we're now seeing and how the situation is currently playing out. Syria itself is in a state of collapse. There are still institutions in Syria. There is still a government. There are still the ministries in Damascus that function. There is still a currency and a central bank and all of those things. But the government itself has no effective legitimacy. And the armed forces are essentially a militia, the same militia that al-Jilani led when he marched on Damascus. It is certainly not an army in any true sense. So, as I said, Syria is contested territory now. And that process, I suspect, will continue. My friend and colleague, Alex Christoforou, says that he speaks to refugees from Syria who have been arriving in Cyprus, and they tell him that the situation in Syria is hellish. I have no reason to doubt that. As for al-Sharaa, I think that this episode has exposed his weakness, and I suspect that weakness will become ever more obviously exposed as the situation in Syria gradually deteriorates and falls apart. So this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Tomorrow I'm going to, if I have the time, if events don't overtake things, return to the subject of Azerbaijan. There's been some rather interesting information about what is going on in Azerbaijan and about the various strands of what is happening involving Azerbaijani citizens. But anyway, this is where I finish my program today. So there'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.